funder or member of the National Advisory Committee, we'd be grateful to have you stand up. I know I ran into at least one. Is Chris Cable here? Hello, yes, and then great, thank you all so much. And of course, we do want to make sure we always include our live stream folks. It's a little difficult to maybe feel included, but keep the conversation going, keep the social media going. Okay, so our final plenary today, these speakers are going to really help us think about how we can put our beliefs into practice and really begin to do that integrated thinking and action across health, climate, and racial equity that tries very hard to put community at the forefront. SPARCC has embraced the complexity of this work, and so we're really excited to hear from some folks that are embodying that on a daily basis. I'd first like to invite up Melissa Jones and then Vien Truong, who will do kind of each 10 minutes of TED Talk style work. And if you have your white postcards, be taking some questions and notes down. We'll gather them up to include your questions into the plenary. So, Melissa? Sorry. Okay, so after you've written your question, raise your card so we know to come around and get it. All right, Melissa, thank you. Please welcome Melissa Jones. Hello.
So I am so glad to be here. In fact, a little bit nervous, but glad to be here, and I don't usually get nervous when I speak. But, you know, maybe because of the nerves, I had one of the strangest dreams I've ever had last night. And I had a dream that I actually didn't get here. That I did wake up in the hotel, and I happened to wake up in a hotel room that was huge, and had a kitchen, and my best friend was there with her new baby and making breakfast, and my cousin was there with her kids, and my brother and his friends, and in my dream we were kind of playing and laughing and having a good time, and it felt like a Saturday, right? And it felt like a Saturday so much that I didn't remember it was a work day. And we were all having a very good time, until we got a phone call that actually I had missed my panel. And the group was looking for 20 minutes so that I could still make some remarks. It was like one of those quirky, funny kind of dreams that happen. But I raise it today for this group, for who we are, because I think this particular group of people here at this displacement forum, with so many experts on housing and economic opportunity, this is really what we're talking about when we talk about displacement, right? We're talking about quality of life, right? So we're talking about how close people get to be to their families, about how much time they have to spend with people who matter to them, and housing is really the baseline piece of that conversation. I think so many of us are professionals in the field, and so we get into the data and we dig into the finance strategies and we think about what the next conversation is with planners. But in the end, that's really what we're talking about. And the ability to spend time with people close to us who have been close to us for a long time and matter to us deeply is being lost in our current housing market. In most of the urban markets in our country, we're not creating communities where your best friend from growing up can start a family, right, and move into a house with an extra bedroom to do it and stay close. We're not creating communities where big families can afford to stay close together and to spend time together in the evenings instead of commuting. And we're not creating places where a family member who works hard for minimum wage at the place we rely on for any kind of service, from dry cleaning to keeping our cars running, can stay close to the family member who went into business. And this is what we're talking about. And we talk about it, and when I talk about it there, it sounds like a quality of life problem. And that's a big enough problem. But it's actually not just a quality of life problem, right? It's a health problem. I'm here today as the executive director of SPARCC, which is the coalition of the Bay Area's public health departments, founded to focus specifically on issues of health equity. We've been studying the connections between housing affordability and health And the connections and impacts of housing on health are quite vast. We know, for example, that families who are spending more than they can afford on housing are spending a third less on food and 5 times less managing their chronic medical conditions because anyone's budget only stretches so far. And this year we released a Housing Affordability and Family Health Report with the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, detailing that for the Bay Area, where I'm from, San Francisco and the greater Bay Area region, has gotten so expensive that a family with 2 working parents at $15 an hour can now afford only 5% of Bay Area neighborhoods. We are at a scale of a crisis that is the kind of scale any public health crisis would be thinking about. It means we can't live together, and it means people are forced further away. In our society, though, we somehow continue to misunderstand just how much displacement is a risk to our health. Our 2017 displacement report details that increased social isolation, adult depression, and stressors on kids' school performance of multiple moves. We know that there's big impacts. And these impacts, these risks, are often misunderstood because they occur further upstream than we generally think about health risk. These are the risks that create the chronic stress that is linked to so many long-term chronic health conditions. And these are risks that can be mitigated by living conditions that create health rather than stress and by facilitating protective factors. This is where I go from depressing to the hope. And that's good news. These risks can be mitigated. They are not a death sentence, and we can change those odds, but make no mistake about it, they result in differences in life expectancy that are severe and very clear. The hope is that despite a runaway housing market, the people in this room, from community organizations, the healthcare sector, and community development, can reshape odds for families. BARHI trains hundreds of government employees across the state of California each year in adaptive leadership because we believe a change in this kind of issue needs fundamental rethinking of how we address it. To do things differently and at the scale we need means our health and well-being plan for displacement must do 2 things simultaneously, and generally we only talk about one or the other, right? We need to stop the current push of low-income families, growing families, and people striving out of the core neighborhoods of our city, right? We are losing many, many people to displacement each year in most of our metro areas. And at the same time, we need to acknowledge the piece that people don't talk as much about, which is that we need more support for communities that have already moved to the belts of working class cities and the suburbs by providing policies that maximize their quality of life. I want to talk to you about 2 community solutions we think can help with that. The first is, at BARHI, we've been staffing an equity kitchen cabinet for the San Francisco Foundation to come up with a plan for the Bay Area of the region that gets real about what it would take, right? We're joined in that effort with our 2 Bay Area SPARCC co-leads, the 6 Wins for Social Equity, which is a community organizing coalition of base building groups, and the Great Communities Collaborative. They're here at this table here. And we focus on 3 priorities. Tenant protections, because most people live in private housing stock, and tenant protections make sure that rent can only be raised a reasonable amount each year and that you can't be evicted for no reason. Most people do not realize how many people are evicted for no cause in high-demand housing markets, or how many times someone's rent might change if they happen to be living in the property of an unscrupulous landlord in 1 year. The second priority, the second P, is housing preservation. Because most housing that is affordable to working class families can change cost at any time, this is really bad for the stability of our communities. There are places throughout the country that have figured out how to preserve this housing through a number of mechanisms, including through community land trust, which I'm sure we'll talk more about later, that can create new opportunities for equity and ownership for low and moderate income people living and working in some of our nation's most expensive housing markets. It's something we need to do more of, and it's something that more flexible financing could help us do more of at scale. And the last piece is the piece that we think about all the time, and it continues to be incredibly important, which is the production of additional deed-restricted affordable housing units. To ensure that there's housing that continues to remain affordable over a long period of time. In my last few minutes, because I come to you today from the Coalition of the Bay Area's public health departments, who are always thinking about what is going to create the most health for the most people, with a particular attention to the most vulnerable to displacement and health risk, I want to end by talking about a strategy I don't think we spend enough time talking about, which is housing preservation. Healthy communities have stable housing that is high quality. It's quite simple, but it's true. And in healthy communities, the housing, even if less expensive, is not less expensive because of mold or other threats that make it less desirable. It's less expensive because communities have invested to have homes available at all income levels, and communities have found ways to create ownership options at all levels so that we can all build the equity that is part of the American dream and that fuels the inheritances that drive the racial wealth gap in our country. There are two panels today, so you know, that I think can help us think through those solutions together. One, how to engage healthcare partners in anti-displacement strategies. That'll happen in the next concurrent workshops in Olympic. We'll talk about healthcare sector partners who have started to invest their own resources in creating housing affordability. This is so important in places where people have moved. In many, many cases, the places where people have moved are places that have not had strong histories of foundation or other kinds of giving. So they are not places that have as much community infrastructure. They are not places where they have had as much investment in housing solutions that include tenant protections and preservation. However, they are also places where healthcare partners are fewer and hold much more of the market share and responsibility for health in those communities. It's costly for them when people are unhealthy. And there's really some incentives to play with to think about how those partners become more connected to housing affordability solutions. The second is a session on how community land trust can be used to defend neighborhoods, which is about the other part of that strategy, right? Is how do we stop the movement of people en masse out of neighborhoods because they're simply no longer affordable and because they're in units with landlords who really would prefer to have somebody else there. So I leave you with those thoughts because I think they're quite important. But I want to thank you today for being here and for the opportunity to talk a bit about the connection between quality and life and health, because I think we can get lost in the mechanisms of how we create the housing. And when we think broadest about quality of life and health, it's going to force our solutions to fit for much bigger, larger groups of people, and it'll force us into new sets of solutions to do that. So thank you.
Melissa's going to grab her water and then come hang out here. Vien Truong will speak next, and then Dana Bourland of JPB will join them for a continuing conversation. So please join me in welcoming Vien.
One thing that we all need to be focused on is building a green economy that is strong enough to lift millions of people out of poverty.
One of the biggest problems is around the high cost of living and the low quality of life. Green up.
All across the country, power plants are poisoning our communities, and they think it's okay. It's not okay.
Poverty and pollution. These issues traditionally have been seen as so big, they have to be tackled separately. What we now understand is that these issues are so interconnected that they can't actually be solved unless they are tackled together.
It is hard to learn if you can't breathe.
We're seeing the struggle on families' faces to pay for medical bills for pollution-related disease.
There's a better technology out there that's not powered by pollution. It's powered by solution.
We really need to make sure that the solutions are aggressive and accelerating us to a clean energy future.
We have a responsibility to spread the good news about sustainability.
This power plant switched away from coal to benefit the air of the community that we're standing in right now.
We have seen that solar makes a huge difference.
Things like affordable housing by transit-oriented development, van pools for migrant farm workers,
green economy jobs, home modernization,
electric vehicles.
Put our kids on buses going forward to a clean energy future
Let's create some jobs for people who are creating these new smart batteries and stuff.
We're actually investing in a new economy for communities that have been underinvested in for so long.
Communities of color are actually hit hardest, first and worst often when it comes to pollution.
I've been having more asthma attacks because high pollution.
Climate change is having impacts in different ways.
It gets very high, so I had to keep my AC running, and that's when my bill got extremely high.
We just continue living and keep struggling.
Join Green for All, where we're addressing poverty and pollution at the same time.
Let's build a more sustainable future with good jobs, better health, and a good environment.
Hello, everybody.
Good morning.
We can play it again. I could just loop it again and again, and I'm done. Well, hello, everybody. I'm Vien Truong. Hello. Thank you. I am the CEO of the Dream Corps, but more importantly, I am the youngest of 11 kids. Yep, just let that sink in. And the mother of twins, 5-year-old twins. So when I'm home, I never even get to finish a thought. So today I get to speak uninterrupted for a few minutes. I'm super excited. And Dana said I get an extra 5 minutes, so I'm now like over the moon giddy. I want to tell you about what I do and all of the stuff and all of the work around housing and building a green economy. But to get there, you first have to know who I am. And to know who I am is to know whom I am from and to know where I am from. My mom was 44 years old when she was pregnant with me. They were running away from Vietnam. The country was at war. Bombs were literally raining down. And she had to climb in the boat with 9 of her kids, a grandma, 80-year-old grandma, and my dad. 9 of her kids, not all 11, because 2 were left behind and in separate boats. In case we died, there would be others to continue the legacy. This is how she thought. We had to row 500 miles to get from Vietnam to Macau, across waters that had literally claimed the lives of many of her friends and family. We survived. And I was born in a refugee camp in Hong Kong. In case you're wondering, it looks exactly like you imagine, like the Japanese internment camps. We were there for a year and finally made it to Portland, Oregon, where my family worked as migrant farm workers, picking strawberries and snow peas. My mom would strap me to her back. When my grandma started getting dementia, we moved to Oakland, California, where there were other Asian people who could help. The only jobs that they could find as people who never learned how to speak English, never had a formal day of education, was in sweatshops. They worked in sweatshops from the time I was 3 until the time I went to college with 11 kids in Oakland during the crack years. I saw my first murder when I was 8 years old. I didn't even know that hearing gunshots at night wasn't normal because I would see drive-bys in middle school. Growing up, hanging out with my parents in the sweatshops, I would hear women talk about the importance of going to college. I never knew this place. What is it? No one in my community ever went. I didn't know why it was important. But through a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and scolding, and screaming, and cajoling, and a whole lot of other stuff, I finally make it to college. All right? Thank you. I was the first one in my family, the only one in my family to ever go to college. The only one in my community that I knew of. In fact, only 4% of the people at Oakland High School, where I'm from, went to college. So when I went there, I was completely baffled. You get salads every day? That's amazing. You get to put whatever you want in it? That's amazing. I was like gorging on the salads. But not only did you learn how to be a good vegetarian and cow and how to be a good, radical, I also learned that my experience was not normal. That it just wasn't normal dodging bullets in school. It just wasn't normal. That when you turn on the kitchen lights and roaches scatter, it's not normal. To not have health care is not normal. And it's not right.
So I decided the purpose of my education wasn't to escape poverty. It was not to leave Oakland, but to figure out how to end poverty. That's what I've been fighting for my whole life. And so I've been blessed in the last 10 years to have helped to pass a number of policies at the federal, state, and local levels, that I've gotten awards from President Obama and from a number of other amazing leaders, that I've been recognized, and that I have the luxury of speaking a few minutes to represent my people, my community on this stage with you. It is an honor and a privilege. And in the last 10 years, I've been part of a team that have helped to pass some billions of dollars. One that I'm especially proud of having been part of is what led to the California Climate Investments Program, right? To date, it's been the biggest fund in history to green up low-income communities. It's been over $2 billion to the poorest and most polluted census tracts in in California, including in Oakland. And it took us 4 years and no one believed in us. But a scrappy group of people, unfunded, actually fought for this law to move money from big polluters into the poorest and most polluted census tracts, including in my own community. In the first year alone, we were able to get $50 million for the city of Oakland to have affordable housing by transit hubs. We were able to get thousands of trees and thousands of solar panels in Oakland alone. So for me, the youngest of 11 kids, growing up in sweatshops in Oakland, committed to fighting for my community, it was amazing to have done this and to be part of the team. And to have friends who worked with us to fight for this, right? Not only that, right after this law passed, because I was working with President Obama on the Stimulus Act, I knew how fast that money can go. And not only that, I knew how quickly people would criticize us. You guys didn't solve every problem in America, with just one policy. You didn't solve poverty with this one policy. I knew it was coming. And so, because you guys remember Solyndra? Some of us? Yeah, that happened, right? I didn't want a Solyndra. And I wanted to figure out how do we then begin to tell the good stories, track the data, track the quantitative and the qualitative. If you're interested, there's websites for that. Uplift CA would tell you all the stories, some of the stories of the people who benefited from these programs. upliftca.org. If you're more of a quantitative person, climatebenefitsca.org tracks the GHG reductions, where the $2.2 billion went, where the 100 million greenhouse gas emission reduction tons reduced, all of the good stuff. And because I have amazing friends and the Bay Area is the best place to live, I was talking to my friend at Enterprise Community Partners, Heather Hood, right after this policy passed and said, I'm really worried. I know this isn't enough money and we have to leverage the private and the public dollars together. How do we do that? And she said, don't worry, I got this. So on her couch on a Saturday morning, eating brunch, we decided that what we could do is actually put together our minds, because women can do this, and figure out how to leverage that. So every dollar that we were putting in this pot of money that we ultimately called, well, we didn't call it, but ultimately the program got called Transformative Climate Communities. What we would do is we would figure out, for every dollar that we would put in there, it can be leveraged with $7 in private investments, with banks and CRA dollars, with foundations and other sectors. And together, we can actually use it to fund not only one-off solar panels and 1,000 trees across the state of California or affordable housing projects here and there. You can actually transform a whole community at a time. More importantly, to power the community's vision for itself. Now, we wouldn't envision this program, but they would create their own plan, and this would be the money to fund that. And I'm hoping that this will come up in the question and answer period, because I will geek out about it all day, but I only have a few more minutes. What I also want to say is that with the 35% of money from big polluters invested in low-income communities, I'm the youngest of 11 kids. I survived by battling my own grounds and fighting for like that one chicken on the table. So I grew up learning how to fight, right? But what I knew at that moment the law passed was to sit down and listen. To listen to what the community wanted. This was money that they had sacrificed lives and lungs for. This isn't our money. This is the community's money. This is the people's money. What would they want the money to be invested in? We had spent a year organizing, going to town halls, church meetings, webinars, phone conferences, everything, asking leaders from across the state, what are the programs that really work for you? What are your priorities? Who's hiring from your community? Who speaks your language? We had to learn the difference between urban and rural poverty. We had to learn the difference between a suburban poverty, the growing suburban poverty. We had to learn the interconnected issues across the state that was how do we actually begin to think about affordable housing as connected to climate change, as connected to transportation, as connected to the growing economy and the old left behind neglected communities. We had to figure those things out and weave them together into what we did and funded. After the policy was passed, after the laws were implemented, after the funds started rolling out, everybody was surprised that we actually started getting thank you letters from community members and community-based organizations. Because y'all know, when there's money on the table, the claws come out, right? That actually was the reverse. We actually started getting thank you letters because people were part of the process and working together. And I think that is key to how we solve things. Because as I go into the next kind of chapter and phase of my thinking and my work, what I'm now realizing is that there are so few spaces like this at SPARCC, this is why I'm so excited to be here, where there are people coming from around the country from different sectors to actually work together, to share ideas together. More recently, one of the things that I'm very worried about is how much we're actually seeing a gulf between the have and the have-nots. So y'all remember that I'm from Oakland, that I'm doing this work because I love Oakland so much. I love my community so much. I have dedicated my entire life to doing that. Recently, what I learned, I looked up and learned 80% of the people who are homeless in any city is from that city. Most of the people who are homeless in Oakland work. They just can't afford it. California is the 5th largest economy in the world. We're bigger than the UK. And yet we have the highest levels of poverty, according to the census tract, because of the cost of living. You know what floored me, though? I had known that for years, people who grew up in my community was forced out. I had known that. What killed me is recently finding out that a number of people that I grew up with, that I went to school with at Oakland High, are now living in tent cities in my own town. That I had built all of this work out of love for my people and my community. And they're not there to benefit from it. So I'm here with you today to implore you, to support you, to encourage you, to be part of you, to be helping to weave together and breaking down these silos. This work is not just a climate fight. It's not just about building a new economy. It is about building a new relationship with each other, with the planet. It is about indigenous rights, about women's rights, about people's rights, about being part and working with the community. This literally is a fight for our future. And the future is worth fighting for. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect. Great. So we'll just have a seat up here. It's so great to be here, and thanks to the entire SPARCC team for making this day possible, allowing us to have these conversations. I know the SPARCC team likes to talk a lot about tables and table setting, but thank you for this amazing table, this beautiful table. I was recently with some of the SPARCC team in Memphis, and so of course, I was reminded of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.'s saying that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. It's one of my favorite sayings. But I'm reminded every day in this work that it's not bending on its own, that we have to take every lever we can possibly find in our toolboxes and create the ones that we don't have and don't even know yet that we need, and use them to bend that arc more targetedly and more quickly towards justice. And for those of us in the room, the community development practitioners, are there any? Yes? Yes. Any public health practitioners? Any environmentalists? Any do-gooders in the room? it is our moral responsibility to think about the actions that we are taking and the impact that they're having on displacement of ideas, of culture, of history, of sacred places, of jobs. Our actions are not, as John Powell said, I'm not an academic so I can quote him, that are unidirectional. They are multi-directional. When we do one thing because we think we're doing good, we have to consider everything else that is going to be impacted. If we're using what we think is a vacant lot for solar, that could be conceived of as just green grabbing if we haven't worked with the community to figure out if they even want it and how the wealth will be created for them and their families. And so this is really, really important work. And it's our responsibility to acknowledge that we work in a complex ecosystem of community and that we are not just doing good, but we have to be intentional about that work and quickly and targetedly bend that arc toward justice. And so at JPB, we don't have it all figured out by any stretch, but we certainly ask different questions of the organizations that come and sit down with us looking for grant support. And I'm wondering, Vien and Melissa, what you have started to do to filter your work differently. Because we know that how we're working now, if we just use the tools that were created in the last century, we're not going to be addressing the issues of the 21st century. So how are you both thinking about how to filter your work and work differently? Do you have some ideas or new ways of thinking that you could share?
Sure. So 3 years ago, BARHI hosted a meeting of the Bay Area public health departments, and we asked senior staff in the health departments, what do you think the Bay Area will look like in 10 years? And for people who care about diversity and about equity, the answers were really disappointing. And they were disappointing but realistic based on the cost of housing, based on what we were seeing in the economy and where jobs are being added and where they weren't. And so we had a conversation about what we would need to do differently to turn that curve. And that's really where our housing affordability work came from. It came from the acknowledgement that people had been pushed in very significant ways to places they hadn't lived before. That in fact, for the Bay Area, the 9-county Bay Area, the only place where the African American community is growing is in East Contra Costa and Solano counties. That's two very small areas for the Bay Area, and that is because of cost of living. And so we had a conversation about, well, what are the interventions for that? And we said the interventions aren't small, right? And we started talking to people who were thinking much bigger. San Francisco Foundation, MTC, others had started a process called CASA to do some regional planning on housing that was, in their words, quote, a swing for the fences, so not the same way. I'm not a baseball fan, but those of you who are know exactly what that means. It means not the same way that it's always been, but different. What are the things that have gotten in our way that we're going to blow past this time? What are the negotiations that are going to be harder and harder fought to get us to something different? And we're now hopefully 2 months out from the end of that process. And part of that process, what made it unique, was we set up an equity, San Francisco Foundation, in fact, and Fred Blackwell, the CEO there, set up an equity kitchen cabinet to focus on making sure whatever solutions got proposed and whatever got landed on really was well advised by the community organizations that have been winning the campaigns across the Bay Area for just cause eviction, for rent control, for really finding solutions that would create protections for broad groups, vast majorities of people in each city. And so that is one thing that's been done differently, to really bring that organizing power into a very formal process.
Terrific, thank you.
For us, we are impatient and we want to accelerate change as fast as possible. It is unacceptable that I see my elders picking trash out of the trash cans when I go to work in order for them to put food on the table. That is just unacceptable, and it's just immoral. And so in order for us to do that, what I have learned in my life is I've passed a lot of policies. I do a lot of things badly. I can write policies really fast. And what I have learned on the night of the election when Trump won is that everything that I have fought for, all the policies that I have worked for, was going to be cut overnight. In fact, I got a call from Administrator Gina McCarthy about the Clean Power Plan the next morning, and we had fought for years for that thing. And I realized that policy is only as good as you have other people come along, right? You can change the heads, but without the heart, it only lasts so long, and it's overnight will change. So we started changing our tactics and our work so that we now know that we have to match our head with our heart. And we have been doing a lot of communication work. We are everywhere, from CNN, our founder Van Jones, to Fox News, to local channels, to from Kansas City to Michigan, across the state. We're making sure that our message and our work is changing hearts and minds. It's why you see our videos. It's why you see the work we do, because those things get embedded. Not only that, and we continue to do our policy work. We've passed 8 state policies on our criminal justice team alone this year. We're about to pass a federal one soon in the next month. And so we're looking at how do we continue to match our policy, our head with our heart. More importantly, as I mentioned earlier, we got to get beyond our siloed and niche thinking of just public work and match it with private sector. How to begin to work smarter and think smarter about leveraging and doing financial modeling in a more efficient way. You know, whether it's using public dollars to bite on the cost of private dollars, whether it's making sure we're leveraging what public monies we have with philanthropic monies. A lot of things that we can actually begin to innovate and think about more. I will add this last piece. Can't afford to forget tech. Really important. In 2016, Oxfam reported that 62 people have as much wealth as half of the world's population. And in 2017, that number became 8. The 8 richest people in the world have as much wealth as half of the world's population. And most of that wealth is from tech. Oakland is gentrified as quickly as it is because of the growth of that. We don't have people who represent the variety and diversity of our communities in the world of tech. And so right now what we're doing is continue to diversify and to put that, to change that. We've trained already 3 cohorts, 60% placement into tech companies. We've had major $1 million collaborations with tech companies. We're building a tech center now in Oakland so that we're pairing Oakland youth with some of the best engineers in Silicon Valley, positioning them for jobs, and they're working together to create public solutions, public problems and solutions to those problems. For instance, we're at affordable housing, right? So right now, if you want to get into an affordable housing, you might have to be on a long wait list. When you get called up, you have to race to get there. You might lose your job in the meantime. What if we automated that system so that it's like an open table? And when you get called up, you actually can get faster without losing your place in line. We can do that. This is our tech solutions. So we're impatient, and now we're working to race across innovation in 4 areas: Silicon Valley, Hollywood, Wall Street, and DC.
One of the things that strikes me in your comments about the changes in the federal administration and what that means for policy is in California, and really in Oakland we see it most, if we're thinking in layers about our policy, we have protections around housing that sit at the local level, at the city level. We have sets of protections that sit at the state, and then we have what's happening in housing in the federal level. We saw that also with access to services for immigrant clients this year. The idea that there are multiple places where we can be passing policy so that if the elected officials change in one place, it doesn't remove all of people's protections or all of the progress we've made on equity, I think has been a really important lesson for us this year.
Agreed. Thanks for sharing that. And, you know, to your point, Vien, I keep thinking maybe we'll get some fake tweets or, you know, like someone's going to hack this and be something incorrect up there.
By the way, my Twitter handle is Vendetta. If y'all tweeting. Like vendetta, V for vendetta, but Vendetta. Got it.
But maybe on a more serious note, one of the questions, and please do send your questions in, it is about data, and you mentioned how you're using that at Dream Corps. The question reads, we're experiencing a political climate nationally and internationally where data and communication are used by the powerful to pin and manipulate the poor and minorities against the very policies designed to uplift them. Whether you believe that's true or not, what are some of the ideas and ways of thinking around data, not just in terms of technology jobs and the tech sector, but how could we use data differently? You mentioned one, but are there other ideas that we can really disrupt, I think, the systems that we're trying to?
Yeah, we have a saying that right now, these days, we have so much data and so little wisdom. And data is actually on our side, except that people who are looking at it are using the wrong ones, right? Criminal justice, the use of data in criminal justice scares me. Right now, we're using biased data, bad algorithms to determine sentencing for people, which turns out, surprise, the data is bad, so then the results are bad. 77% longer sentencing for people of color. Yeah. So if we begin to actually look at how do we make sure that don't make my mistake. Don't build a future with your head down, only to look up and realize that the people you were building it for is gone. Don't do that. Right now, we're worried about, we launched the AI Summit with Fei Li. She runs Google's artificial intelligence and Stanford's artificial intelligence. She's probably the best, smartest person on artificial intelligence. Half of the work duties in America can be automated today. Okay, remember that. Also, we're seeing a growing trend. If we're worried about homelessness, think about this scary problem. We're seeing a growing trend right now where people are now doing more and more independent contractor work. They don't have health care. They don't have a pension or retirement. Half of America doesn't have $500 in their savings account. Half of the jobs can be automated. At the federal and state levels, we're cutting pensions, Social Security, and health care, so public safety programs like firehouses and libraries. We're seeing the growth of fires. All of these things are coming together. Hold it together, people. So as we continue to see this growth between the have and the have-nots, how are we beginning to think about how do we use technology for us and with us, bend it towards the good and the solutions, and begin to think about the concerns of where it's going towards the bad, and making sure that we're not using data to get us in that direction. Yeah. Which is why we're building a tech hub.
Yeah, and I think the other piece with data is the story. So I think we can sit in this room and talk about the numbers that you just raised. And there's a lot of understanding of structural racism. There's an understanding of how wealth has not traveled in families and for what reasons, right? So there's an understanding of what might be behind that data that's beyond an individual's fault. That is not the conversation when you're out in broad community. Often those numbers get blamed on individual people when they have a structural reason. So I think the piece about data, public health spends a lot of time on data, so I won't say we don't spend any time on data, but the piece that BARHI spends our time on is the story, right? What is the data telling us? What does it mean, and why is it happening? Because if we're spending our time on the data without the story, it reinforces stereotypes people hold about who makes it and who doesn't and why. And so I think that's a very important piece of the data.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely. We're getting some questions around ways to engage with communities, to have discussions about health inequities, and also then what are solutions that would really lead not just to more service provision, but in an actual transfer of wealth into communities, as this question asked.
Yeah. So BARHI has a framework that we share all the time, everywhere, every moment, except for today, that is all about where health inequities come from, and where people often think of the healthcare sector or system, right? And they think about once you get to a doctor's office, do you get the care you need? Do you have access to get into the doctor's office? And is the doctor good enough to help you get better, right? Well, actually, there's a whole lot that happens and that impacts your health, 80% of your health, before you're ending up in a doctor's office. If you ended up in a doctor's office with a serious issue, we're on a losing slope of that battle, right? And actually, much of it is in living conditions, and the living conditions, service environment, where we are all influenced by power, right? Power and money, power dynamics. some of which are invisible. They're just the way things, government or business, have done things for a long time that you don't even think about, are automated, just happens that way, and doesn't get interrupted and causes inequity. And some of the things are more insidious than that, right? We use that tool in public health departments who go out and do community assessments, have conversations with community about what their priorities should be. Use that tool to talk about what's going on right now in living conditions and what's impacting it, and then therefore what should the solutions be. The thing that I'm most excited about right now is the level of energy I'm seeing around anchor institution strategy, both in the healthcare sector and in government. This idea that you have your main business of whatever you do. You help people get better if you're a hospital. You are delivering services if you're a government, right? And in the course of doing that regular work, you are an economic engine. In many communities, you're the top employer, you're the biggest spender, or you're among the biggest spenders. And so where are you doing your spending, right? So that you're spending in local businesses that are more likely to be employing local people. And we know that women and minority-owned businesses are both more likely to be employing local people, more likely to be employing a diverse workforce, and more likely to give people a shot who are trying to get back into the work market, right? So to see more money flowing there to start to reinforce some of that work, I think, is really powerful. And in governments, what we see is governments breaking contracts into size that more moderate-sized businesses can then access. And I think that kind of thing is a really important strategy.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
I think for me, when I do this work, I think of 3 rules. First, I grew up in Oakland, and it's where the birthplace of the Black Panthers are. And we claim Tupac Amaru Shakur. I don't know about y'all, but I think he's from Oakland. And for me, I grew up with the Robin Hood theory, right? For too long and too often and too commonly, people rob the hood, right? There's a poor people's tax on extras, on everything. And so how do we flip that to begin thinking about where is the money? And how do we begin to reinvest it back into the very communities that have been paying for it with their lives and their lungs? Which is why when we created this program around the $2 billion, it's looking at the biggest polluters, not taxpayer money. Where are the biggest polluters? And how do we make them accountable to clean up and pay up, to invest in the very communities and in the community's vision and in the community's priorities? So that to us was key. That's the first rule. The second rule is to make sure that we're doing what Angela Glover Blackwell said. I was there at the launch of SPARCC and was lucky to work with Shelley and to be at the table with giants like Angela Glover Blackwell and John Powell and others. And she said something I would never forget. She said, when you look at this work, ask who pays, who benefits, and who's at the table. I always ask that question. And if the people who you're proposing to serve is not at the table, I would challenge who you're really working for. Too often policies are done to us and on our backs and not with us. And if you want us at the takeoff, if you want us at the landing, have us at the takeoff. And I think for me, it's always like, growing up in Oakland, the youngest of 11 kids, you make everything stretch. You put water in the shampoo bottles, right? You shake it up, you have more soap. Like, you make everything stretch. So don't just rely on the limited coffers that you have access to, whether it's philanthropic or whether it's public dollars. Put in some private financing, put in some smart modeling, shake it up, make it stretch. So those are my 3 rules.
Those are good ones, really good ones.
Shampoo bottle theory.
Although I heard shampoo bottles, I think, are only filled with water anyway, but for another day. But that's a good
The other thing that we've been seeing community groups talk more and more about is this issue of who's stripping money from communities. And we talk about it with payday loans. We've been thinking about that for a long time, and people have been doing good action on that. But actually, the fees that people are paying for parking violations that go up on an automated way in a week when everybody's getting paid every 2 weeks or once a month, and the cost that has for people and the asset stripping that does, the way that people then lose their license, and then the complicating factor that has for people in their employment. Either they have to drive without it and risk getting caught, or aren't driving and are having a really hard time getting to work, especially if they've had to move out of the core city because it's too expensive. That has huge impacts. And as people have started to talk more about that, there's been some really good solutions coming in particular out of San Francisco for people to look at, where they have realized that actually if they offer payment schedules or reduced fees, they actually get more money, because when people look at the cost of those fines and fees, they're so expensive that they don't pay them because they feel like they can't pay them. But if you give them a choice to pay less, the city actually gets more money and people are not being stripped of their assets, right? So I think that that's another thing that sometimes in working with community, and particularly for government institutions, you have a planning process that's required, right? Or for a community group, you have a planning process that's required and you're thinking about the set of things you know are important. If you spend a little more time in the open dialogue about what's impacting people, you start to hear things that people have taken for granted as being just the way things are, like the parking tickets, right? And can really start to use data then to figure out, move it from the anecdote to how many people it's affecting and what the cost is on them, and then design the policy solution. So I would say that's one other way.
Yeah, that's a great example. Maybe in closing, let's assume we're all going to come back in a year. What would both of you like to hear as the report out from the year we're about to have that this room was able to accomplish or just stopped doing, maybe? Either retired practices or started to do something. What do you want to hear when we come back in a year that's happened as a result of getting together in this conversation?
I like that you said you're impatient. I like to think I'm pleasantly impatient, but I know my partners would say I'm just impatient. But I do think that this work is so important. And like you, when you see particularly the homelessness in Oakland, and you just think just 10 years ago that we didn't see that. And then when we look at the demographics and know it's 80% African American in a city with such a strong Black history, it's a heartbreak. And so I guess I would love to hear conversations at tables about what people have done when they felt like they got impatient and figured out something that they felt like usually had to take a long time, that suddenly is moving fast because you found a way to do it when you felt there was no other alternative. I think that that's what I'm hoping we have stories about next year, and I hope that we all do, because I do think that the urgency helps sometimes break us through some barriers.
Mm-hmm, absolutely.
Yeah.
Before I come on stage every time, I think about my kids, my twins, and I think about why I'm here instead of there with them. And I ask that you hold in your hearts the images of your kids or your nieces and nephews or the kids that you love. And you think about the fact that you got them in your hearts. Yeah. The IPCC just said we really only have 12 more years before things get really bad. And anybody who was here in California during the fires of the last month, when we couldn't even walk outside, when everybody had masks on, in the Bay Area, in LA, you know, when you grew up in West Oakland, people would say, why don't you just get up and move? It's so bad, just leave. Nobody could leave. Where could you go? It is unsafe. And then in a year from now, it's only 11 years. And maybe the kids whose images are in your heart won't even ever get to see a clear blue sky or a night full of stars. What wouldn't you do? I hope that we can begin to break out of doing things the same way. That is the very definition of insanity if we think that's going to turn out differently. It is not time for us to sit on our laurels. It is time for us to fight like our lives really depend on it, because it does.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. Awesome. Thank you so much.